So, welcome again to our C.S. Lewis Connected event, which is organized by the C.S. Lewis and Kindreds Spirits Society and the Alexandru Ioan Cuza University of Iasi, Romania. We are here from 20 countries, and it is just exciting to be together. We have learned the last 3 years to cross the barrier of the screen, and in a kind of magical way, we enjoy participating in this adventure of discovering new things about C.S. Lewis heritage with special guests. His work has proven to be meaningful and exciting to millions of readers, which is why he has come to be regarded as one of the most important authors of the last 100 years. As at the previous meeting, I just want to reinforce that the reality of the Ukrainian war has been very close for us here in Iași, especially through the big numbers of refugees that have come, but also now hearing every day about the bombing attacks that are happening is overwhelming. So to talk about Mere Christianity, written by the Oxford and Cambridge scholar and professor of medieval and Renaissance literature, C.S. Lewis, today, as its 70th anniversary, is in a very strange way more actual than we have ever imagined. During the Second World War, Lewis was asked by the BBC to encourage the British people by giving a series of radio talks. In fact, during the 3 weeks in which he delivered the first series of talks in London, actually the city was firebombed 230 times. These broadcasts were listened by upwards of 1 million people and eventually were published as small booklets and then expanded into Mere Christianity, which was published in England in 1952. It has since been translated into almost 40 different languages, and it has sold more than 20 copies since and has been ranked as one of the most important Christian books of all time, one of the 2 most important. We thought that maybe it will be interesting for you to know that Mere Christianity was translated for the first time in Romanian in 1987 by the Romanian Missionary Society based in Wheaton, Illinois, which was printed and distributing theological books for Romanians behind the Iron Curtain. 3,000 copies were smuggled into our country along with the Bibles, by Christians from the States who were risking their liberty for this. I'm thankful for the fact that one of them got to me in 1889, before the revolution. Being raised with a complete atheist education, it played a significant role in introducing Christian faith to me, answering to all my questions regarding the reasonable arguments for Christianity. It's one of the reasons I'm here today. This version was reprinted in 1991 and in 1994. 10 years were to pass before the release of a new version entitled Christianity Pure and Simple, edited and published by Humanitas Publishing House in 2004. If you want to learn more about the reception of C.S. Lewis in the post-communist Romania, we will give you the link for a special article from Lingua Culture that we published a few years ago. We are especially pleased that our guest will be Dr. Michael Ward this evening, who is a C.S. Lewis scholar and specialist from Oxford, but I will just introduce our host, who is always Dr. Kirstin Jeffrey Johnson, a George MacDonald scholar from Canada. She lectures internationally on MacDonald and the Inklings and faith in the arts. She is a co-editor of Informing the Inklings. She has published many articles in the field. She appears in the documentary The Fantasy Makers, and she is currently completing a book on MacDonald. But she also authored and forwards and afterwards to the Romanian translation of MacDonald's The Golden Key and Barfield's The Child and the Giant that we published here in Iași. She is on the advisory board of Inklings Journal 7, a founding board member of the C.S. Lewis and Kindreds Society of Eastern and Central Europe, and co-chair of the George MacDonald Society. So I invited our beloved host, Kirstin, probably the most wonderful McDonald's scholar, to introduce our guest and lead the conversation.
Thank you, Denise. One of a growing number of McDonald's scholars. Hurrah. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here once again with colleagues and friends, old and new, from literally around the world. Bună seara to those in Romania and further east. Bună ziua to those closer to me in time zone, and bună dimineața to those of you westward who are just waking up. We're spanning the globe today, and it is good to be together. Pace. Now, a reminder to those of you who have not to please mute. I frequently forget to do that or accidentally unmute myself. So to save yourself from embarrassment and to not impede others, if you would mute yourself for right now. And as we carry on today, if you have questions for Dr. Ward, can you put them in the direct message to Agora Christi in the meeting chat? If you just throw one out to me in the chat, there's going to be so many comments. I'm not great at spotting all the questions there. So if you direct message it to Adora Christi, actually administrator or Adora Christi, what should we say? Andre?
They will send them to Agora Christi with the Agora Christi, yes.
Sorry, yes, Agora Christi. And then they will forward those to me. That would be helpful for me. Thank you. After today's session, we're going to let Dr. Ward disappear right at 6:30 his time because he's got other duties to go off to. But afterwards, we're going to have just a casual chat time for anybody who would like to stick around and catch up with friends or discuss further in conversation with each other some of the things that Dr. Ward has talked about. And we're very privileged to have Dr. Brenton Dickinson facilitating that for us afterwards. Today's gathering deserves particular acknowledgement because I know that amongst the many here, I believe there's well over 300 people from around the world, are not just included numerous gifted Lewis scholars who've taught on and or published on Mere Christianity, many lifelong close readers of Mere Christianity, possibly a good number of Mere Christianity critics, perhaps even those who remain mystified as to why Mere Christianity or even Lewis is so significant to others. But we also have amongst us those for whom, like Denise, this particular book was truly life-transforming. People in China, India, America, Hungary, Rwanda, Australia, Poland, people whose lives had a shift in trajectory because of something Lewis scribed onto these pages. And if you are amongst that number, you will know that you're not alone. Well-regarded theologians, politicians, philosophers, scientists, entrepreneurs have all identified themselves as amongst those who, even whilst perhaps disagreeing with parts of the book, have nonetheless had their lives I'm going to have trouble today, so heads up for you guys. I may say a few words wrong. Today is one of those days I cannot say that. People who've nonetheless had their lives, those of you who English is a second language know that those with English as a first language struggle sometimes too. Those who have had their lives forever changed by Lewis's insight in Mere Christianity. J. Packer, John Stott, Francis Collins, Jimmy Carter, N.T. Wright, Alistair McGrath, Chuck Colson, Thomas Howard, Jill Briscoe, Peter Kraft, Dwight Longnecker, Callisto Ware, Mark Knoll, Alan Jacobs, Jamie Smith, even Thomas Monahan, founder of Domino's Pizza. The list goes on. Mere Christianity, the book, as you may know, was adapted from a series of BBC radio talks aired between 1941 and 1944. As Denise has reminded us, those are significant dates. These talks had first been published independently as 3 separate volumes. Broadcast Talks in 1942, Christian Behavior in 1943, and Beyond Personality in 1944. They were published together as a single book 70 years ago in 1952. Whilst not immediately so, this collation eventually worked its way into the stacks as a classic text in modern religious literature, one which has been described as both Lewis's most popular as well as his most disparaged book. Perhaps its greatest signature is Lewis's voice. The Times Literary Supplement described it as a work of quite unique power, making theology interesting, even exciting, and one might almost say uproariously funny. The Guardian wrote that Lewis's learning is abundantly seasoned with common sense. His humor and his irony are always at the service of the most serious purposes, and his originality is the offspring of enthusiastically loyal orthodoxy. Today, we have the privilege of spending some time with someone well familiar with both the text and its author, the Revd Dr Michael Ward. Dr. Ward is a theology and literature critic who has been teaching on Lewis and his writings for about 30 years now. Perhaps best known for his publication, Planet Narnia, Dr. Ward has written numerous other texts, including his recent and highly lauded After Humanity, a guide to C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man. A student of both Oxford and Cambridge, he did his PhD at the Institute of Theology, Imagination, and the Arts at St. Andrews, where we both had the privilege of being supervised by Professor Trevor Hart. Dr. Ward travels extensively, lecturing upon especially, though not solely, Lewis and the theological imagination. When not traveling or teaching, either in his role as Professor of Apologetics at Houston Baptist University or as a member of the Faculty of Theology and Religion at the University of Oxford, he is enjoying duties as a Catholic priest. Some of you may even recognize Dr. Ward from his most recent of dalliances with the silver screen, when he was cast in the role of C.S. Lewis's vicar in the film A Most Reluctant Convert. As always, however, I am keen for you to know that our guest is more than just a talking head, more than simply a fount of Lewisian knowledge. Much more important than Michael Ward being an accomplished scholar is that he is also a well-loved and loving uncle, godfather, and friend. He has a beautiful singing voice and occasionally, maybe more than occasionally, mischievous sense of humor, and can give quite likely the best recitation of The Owl and the Pussycat you will ever hear. Like Peter Wimsey, he has a little-known gift for bell ringing, and forgive me, at one time in his life, Kit Kats were more than a common staple in his diet. So you see, he is human after all. Welcome, Michael, and thank you for being with us today. I'd love for you to start us off into our exploration of mere Christianity by telling us about your first acquaintance with it and perhaps a little of your response at the time.
Thank you, Kirstin. Good day, everybody, and thank you, Denise, for your background organization of this event. Yes, to answer your question, Kirstin, my first exposure to mere Christianity happened probably when I was about 12 or 13. I'd already been introduced to C.S. Lewis via the Narnia books, which my parents had read to me when I was younger. And then when I was old enough to read Narnia for myself, I did so. And then I got into, I think, The Great Divorce and the Screwtape Letters, and then into Mere Christianity, which my father had spoken of very warmly. Indeed, Mere Christianity was pretty influential on him, I think. It wasn't actively crucial in his own adult conversion to Christianity, but I think it played a significant part. And so he encouraged me to look at it and spoke highly of it. And so, yeah, I must have been, as I say, 12 or 13, and it impressed me hugely. It was very accessible, I thought, very persuasive. And I've read it numerous times since, of course, especially since becoming a C.S. Lewis professor, scholar, writer. And it is an amazing book for reasons that we can explore. But yes, that's my first exposure when I was an early teenager.
Do you enjoy it right away?
Yes, I did. I thought it was fantastic. It was powerful. It was direct. Lewis spoke as one who himself believed what he was talking about. That, I think, is a major part of the book's success, that it comes from a truly and deeply converted man. So it has the ring of authenticity and personal commitment behind it. But it also springs from someone who was a brilliant communicator. He knew how to put the right words in the right order, and how to unfold an argument, and how to build to a climax, and how to throw in things which he wanted to say, though they weren't absolutely of the first importance. He knew how to, you know, make sotto voce statements, as it were, under his voice. It's just a brilliant piece of rhetoric from that point of view. I think lots of people should study Mere Christianity, just if they want to understand about successful communication, especially verbal communication over the radio, because we mustn't underestimate the importance of its origin as broadcast talks on the wireless. 15-minute talks is how these chapters originated. And Lewis didn't know who he was talking to. You know, anybody could tune in from across the country, anybody of any level of knowledge or education, any familiarity with Christianity or faith in general. So he had to make things extremely accessible and unmistakably clear at first hearing. So he wrote for the ear more than for the eye. And I think that's one of the reasons why Mere Christianity comes alive so much when you do read it, because it's written as in a sort of conversational and vernacular register, which immediately conveys the impression of a living voice, even though, of course, C.S. Lewis has himself now been gone for many decades. But it just has that vital and existentially urgent note to it.
It's one of Lewis's particular gifts, I think. He's wonderful read aloud. Not just listened to, but read aloud.
Yes, and indeed that is true of all his works, actually, not just Mere Christianity. It's really only Mere Christianity that was written as broadcast talks. But all his books are very readable, in large part, I think, because his own training as a student here at Oxford, where I'm speaking to you from today. As an undergraduate at Oxford, your weekly task is to write an essay which you will read aloud to your tutor. And that's still the practice here at Oxford. So right from the start, Lewis was trained in writing for the ear of one person, his tutor, in that particular context. And that was a skill that he, was able to transfer to a vast audience, an audience of hundreds of thousands, millions probably, when he came to broadcast these talks in the 1940s.
Can you, with that reminder that they were initially talks, can you tell us a little bit more about the movement from the 3 talks or even the 3 books that I was waving around earlier into this one text, the genesis and reception of those books of that book when it first came out as a united?
Yes, the assembling of those 3 earlier books, which themselves incorporate 4 series of broadcast talks, that occurred, as you said, 70 years ago in 1952. But it happened without much fanfare, to be honest. There wasn't a new marketing campaign. There wasn't any great special effort to announce it as something new. It was more like just a sort of tidying up exercise to bring these 4 talks series and these 3 volumes together under an umbrella heading, Mere Christianity, which was stuck onto these books almost as an afterthought. Well, I mean, it was as an afterthought. Lewis had never intended to write a standalone book, a standalone volume in its own right called Mere Christianity. That just, it grew organically and inadvertently, you might say. And that's something that we could discuss, the suitability of the term Mere Christianity. But because it did not happen with any great fanfare, it took a while for Mere Christianity to establish itself as a real classic. I mean, Lewis's face got on the cover of Time magazine in the United States because of the Screwtape Letters, not because of Mere Christianity. And I think it was, you might say, it would be interesting to do a historical study of Mere Christianity and see how its reception, how its commercial success grew over the decades. My own impression is that it got a very significant boost in the 1970s after Charles Colson wrote about it as largely responsible for his own conversion. Chuck Colson had been one of President Richard Nixon's right-hand men in the White House during the Watergate scandal, and he'd been sent to prison for his part in that scandal. And out of that came his Christian conversion, a conversion that was brought about largely through reading the chapter on pride in Mere Christianity. But so we're talking now it's the mid-70s, the late, I can't remember when Born Again, his book came out, maybe it was even 1980. But that put Mere Christianity front and center, especially before American evangelicals, as a book which could be absolutely life-transforming for a hardened criminal like Richard Nixon's hatchet man. And I think that gave it a sort of cachet in the 1980s, which is never lost.
But the edition that I was waving around here, the introduction to this edition, is written by Chuck Colson.
In fact, can I read you what Chuck Colson says? I've got it written down here. A friend of Charles Colson's read to him the chapter on pride, as I mentioned, and Colson later described it as one of the extraordinary moments of my life. The words from that book ripped through the protective armor in which I had unknowingly encased myself for 41 years. As I left my friend's home that night, I accepted his gift of the copy of Mere Christianity. I was deeply moved by the chapter he had read. As I got into my car, the White House tough guy, the hatchet man, or so the press called me, crumbled in a flood of tears, unable to drive, calling out to God with the first honest prayer of my life. That was the night Jesus Christ came into my life. Since then, I've given out hundreds of copies of Mere Christianity and have met thousands whose lives have been transformed by it. It is the book God has used most powerfully in my life, apart from his own word, the Bible, of course. And Chuck Colson, after his conversion, he went on to found a ministry called Prison Fellowship, which works still today in prisons around the world. As a direct response to Lewis's words in that book. An absolutely amazing story of a turnaround, showing you the importance of Lewis's own response to the invitation that he got in 1941 from the BBC to give just a brief series of talks on, as it turned out, philosophy. Lewis could never have foreseen that, 40 years later, this was going to happen to such a prominent person in an entirely other country. It's amazing how God uses people, and how even our little efforts can have huge effects down the road.
Simply doing what is before you, that you know you're called to do. Well, given that sort of catapulting that Colson helped do to Mere Christianity as an icon of Christian apologetics, certainly in North America in the 20th century, the latter half of the 20th century. Can we stop for a moment and speak a little bit about apologetics generally? Who did Lewis think apologetics were for? I mean, Colson was a prime example of somebody who was not, I'm not going to say was not a Christian. He certainly was not living a certain life. I do not know where he was theologically at that point in time. But Who is Lewis writing his apologetics for? Christians who are trying to sort things out? Is he writing Mere Christianity for Christians, for atheists, for agnostics? What does he see as the role of apologetics, and how do you think he would fit Mere Christianity into that?
Well, apologetics, of course, just means defending the faith. Doesn't mean saying you're sorry for being a Christian. It means these are the reasons why I am a Christian, and those reasons can be pitched at any number of levels depending on who you're talking to. And Lewis could sometimes operate at a very high academic level in works like Miracles, for instance. I think that's pretty highbrow, really. And he could work at very popular levels like Mere Christianity, where he doesn't know who he's speaking to. He just has to go to a sort of an entry level way of presenting the faith, and everything in between. So it all depends on who he's speaking to. With regard to Mere Christianity in particular, he decided that he would begin his case for Christianity by speaking actually not about theology or spirituality, but about philosophy and ethics. So when the BBC invited him in 1941 to do a series of talks, he wrote back saying, "I think what I mainly want to talk about is the law of nature, or objective right and wrong. It seems to me that the New Testament, by preaching repentance and forgiveness, always assumes an audience who already believe in the law of nature and know they have disobeyed it. In modern England, we can't at present assume this, and therefore most apologetics begins a stage too far on. The first step is to create or recover the sense of guilt." So that's a good little summary of book one of Mere Christianity, right and wrong as a clue to the meaning of the universe. Lewis is going to defend the idea of a law of nature. He's going to defend the idea that all human beings have a conscience. They know something about right and wrong, truth and falsehood, even if it's not related to any systematic religious expression. And he's going to say, well, where does this sense of right and wrong come from? Why do we think that people should be honest rather than dishonest? He starts in a brilliant way by in a dramatic little tableau, doesn't he? By saying everybody has heard people quarreling. Sometimes it sounds funny and sometimes it sounds merely unpleasant, but however it sounds, I believe we can learn something very important from listening to the kind of things they say. They say things like, "How'd you like it if anyone did the same to you? That's my seat. I was there first. Leave him alone. He isn't doing you any harm. Why should you shove in first? Give me a bit of your orange. I gave you a bit of mine. Come on, you promised." People say things like that every day. Educated people as well as uneducated, and children as well as grown-ups. Now that's just a brilliant way of capturing the attention, because of course we all have had that experience. I always remember the particular line, "Give me a bit of your orange, I gave you a bit of mine." That's superb. That concretizing, that dramatizing of what might otherwise escape into highfalutin philosophical discourse is immediately rooted and grounded in an everyday experience that everybody can recognize, but which we don't tend to reflect upon very much generally. But here's Lewis, and he's going to reflect upon it for us and draw some interesting conclusions about why we believe that sharing and honesty and fairness are objectively important values, not just subjectively felt. If it was merely subjective, as he goes on to say, if ethics was merely subjective matter, then why would we currently be fighting a world war, because he's writing in the early 1940s, against the Nazis in Germany? Why would we think that Nazi morality was any worse than our own morality? Why would they need to be defeated? It's because we recognize that Nazism is objectively wrong and evil and must be defeated. So he goes from sharing an orange to to a world war in a few easy steps, actually. And he shows that there is a continuum in this ethical pursuit, which connects the tiniest little domestic inconveniences with the greatest national endeavor currently unfolding on the Western Front in mainland Europe. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant book.
Well, that's part of his setup for us as readers of the text. In a later printing, I think what strikes me as an important addition to his setup occurs in his later preface that doesn't appear in the first preface. And that is how, for me, this is really striking and goes alongside the sharing of the orange, actually, is how insistently ecumenical he is in that second preface. There's almost, to me, there's almost a tone similar to his frustration when he says, my readers don't believe me when I say MacDonald's the most important writer for me. It's the same exasperation almost to me. And he's certainly more insistently ecumenical than some of his readers are. Can you explain to us why this is clearly so important for him to emphasize in the later printing, and perhaps how this too sets us up, just like the sharing of the orange sets us up for what unfolds afterwards?
Yes, well, here we need to go back to the fact that mere Christianity was an umbrella term held over these earlier works after the fact. The term mere Christianity never actually appears in any of the broadcast talks. But as Lewis surveyed what he'd written and asked himself, well, how can I find some unity and thematic consistency in what I've written? He drew upon this term, mere Christianity, which he had actually already used in the Screwtape Letters and in an introduction he'd written to St. Athanasius's book, The Incarnation of the Word of God. But the term mere Christianity never appears in the broadcast talks or in those earlier little books that became mere Christianity. But Lewis was already interested in the concept of mere Christianity, by which he means broad, mainstream, central Christian faith, which pretty much all Christians of whatever tradition, whatever denomination would subscribe to. And so, given that Lewis had written those earlier works from just that stance, he hadn't been trying to promote a particular Anglican theology. He himself was an Anglican, but he hadn't been promoting the Church of England particularly. The very first book, as I just mentioned, is not really theology at all, it's philosophy. So he hadn't been arguing for any particular corner of Christendom, as it were. And so I think he saw that mere Christianity was going to be a convenient catch-all title that would pretty much include everything he'd said. Now we can debate about precisely whether everything he said is agreed upon by all Christians of all times in all places, but it's broadly accurate. It's accurate enough for the purposes he has in mind. Now, why he was so interested in mere Christianity is another question. I myself think that probably a lot of it has to do with his own upbringing in Belfast, in the north of Ireland. Lots of people tend to think that C.S. Lewis was English, but of course he was Irish. And he was born in Belfast in 1898. And this is before the division of Ireland into the north and the south. That happened only in the 1920s. So Lewis was born into a culture which was very keenly, sadly, tragically divided between the Catholic and the Protestant sectors. It was a very sectarian community. It still is to a certain degree, though much, much, much less so than it was when Lewis was growing up. And the religious divide between the Catholics and the Protestants was entangled with a lot of irrelevant political questions about nationalism and loyalism to the British Crown, or did you want independence and a republic, as of course eventually happened in the South. And Lewis, growing up in that environment, I think, first of all, got very quickly tired of the stupidity of the entanglements of religious and political questions, and also saw through very quickly some of the way in which religious loyalties are just rendered or presented through social markers, through names, through, you know, if you called your son Bill or William, that you were clearly a Protestant. you were gesturing towards William of Orange. But if you called your son, I don't know, Peter, that was a clear marker of a Catholic loyalty. And so if by accident a Protestant called his son Peter or a Catholic called his son William, that was a great faux pas. But how stupid, how silly to get entangled in all these irrelevancies. And Lewis would have none of it, and he would never be drawn publicly, or hardly ever be drawn publicly, on anything like a denominational affiliation. And even in private correspondence, when people tried to draw him into discussing, for instance, why he wasn't a Catholic, he would say, well, I have my reasons, and if I gave them to you, you would have your reasons as to why I should become a Catholic, and I could counter those, and we could go on endlessly. But haven't we got better things to talk about? So he was a very irenic and diplomatic and non-adversarial, non-controversial person in terms of intra-Christian debates. He was interested in the really crucial distinction, as he saw it, between those who worship and those who don't. And to that extent, he said, you know, there's even more common ground between, you know, Christian Jews and Muslims than between those and non-believers, you know, pure secularists. That's the great divide as far as he was concerned. So in Mere Christianity, in that preface that you just mentioned, he says this: ever since I became a Christian, I have thought that the best, perhaps the only service I could do for my unbelieving neighbors was to explain and defend the belief that has been common to nearly all Christians at all times. I had more than one reason for thinking this. In the first place, the questions which divide Christians from one another often involve points of high theology or even of ecclesiastical history, which ought never to be treated except by real experts. And secondly, I think we must admit that the discussion of these disputed points has no tendency at all to bring an outsider into the Christian fold. Finally, I got the impression that far more and more talented authors were already engaged in such controversial matters than in the defense of mere Christianity. That part of the line where I thought I could serve best was also the part that seemed to be thinnest, and to it I naturally went.
I think this is a good point to pull in. You referred earlier to the title. Many people think that Lewis is the source of the phrase mere Christianity, but of course he is not. Would be, I believe, Baxter.
That's right, yes. His name was Richard Baxter. Richard Baxter was a 17th century English divine. He was a preacher and a prolific writer. And he himself, Richard Baxter, had suffered greatly in a time of great sectarian controversy and warfare. Of course, the Civil War in England took place in the 17th century. There was a lot of religious repression around, but Richard Baxter was a theological moderate, and an inveterate peacemaker. Let me read what Baxter himself says in a work that he wrote in the last decade of his life. This is Richard Baxter. I am a Christian, a mere Christian, of no other religion, and the church that I am of is the Christian church, and hath been visible wherever the Christian religion and church hath been visible. But must you know what sect or party I am of? I am against all sects and dividing parties. But if any will call mere Christians by the name of a party, because they take up with mere Christianity, creed and scripture, and will not be of any dividing or contentious sect. I am of that party which is so against parties. So that's where C.S. Lewis gets the term from. And it's interesting that the Baxter says he's of that party. Lewis takes it slightly more loosely. He says this, C.S. Lewis says this in his preface, the 1952 preface to Mere Christianity. He says, "The reader should be warned that I offer no help to anyone who is hesitating between two Christian denominations. You will not learn from me whether you ought to be an Anglican, a Methodist, a Presbyterian, or a Roman Catholic. This omission is intentional. Even in the list I've just given, the order is alphabetical. There is no mystery about my own position. I am a very ordinary layman of the Church of England, not especially high, nor especially low, nor especially anything else. But in this book, I am not trying to convert anyone to my own position." So he's not trying to convert people to Anglicanism, but neither is he actually trying to convert people to mere Christianity, because he says that mere Christianity is not itself a kind of replacement church or a kind of overarching party to which a Christian could belong in the long term. It's more like an entryway. It's like the hallway into a house. If you can get people to believe in mere Christianity, that's like getting them in across the threshold of your dwelling place into the hallway. But the hallway, although it's common to, it leads you to the other parts of the house, it's not a place where you can live. It's in the rooms of the house where there are chairs and fires and meals, and you must go into those rooms in order to live out your Christian life in the long term. And those rooms are labeled Anglicanism, Presbyterianism, Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, whatever it may be. And you've got to choose which one of those rooms you're going to live in. And he's not going to tell you which one you should choose. All he's going to say is that you should not choose the room based on the attractiveness of the paneling or the woodwork of that door, or because you like the look of a particular doorkeeper, or because you like the sounds of the worship going on the other side of the door. You've got to ask yourself, is Christ present in this room? Is his spirit alive? That's the key question. At all times, you've got to ask the fundamental question about truth and fidelity to Christ, rather than to any second order questions about liturgy or architecture or social standing. Those are all not utterly irrelevant, but they are definitely secondary. They shouldn't be decisive.
I want to follow on the thread of misattribution. Lewis and Baxter on Mere Christianity, and thank you for giving a clear elucidation of what Lewis is meaning and what he says there. Many people mistakenly think that what is referred to as the trilemma, liar, lunatic, or Lord, originates here in Mere Christianity. Many people have stated that it does. Of course, Lewis uses the argument in The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe with Professor Kirk and Lucy, or with Peter Susan, when they're discussing not any assertion of divinity, but rather Lucy's claim of having been in Narnia. That particular use of it by Lewis is far more similar to MacDonald's use of it in Lilith, when Mr. Vane and Raven have the same discussion, and Mr. Raven challenges Vane with the trilemma. But to the satisfaction of some and the dissatisfaction of others, versions of the trilemma date back as far as the early church fathers. So when Lewis uses it here, is he intentionally engaging with a particular tradition? Is it just an easy navigation of logic for him? It's certainly one that's dissatisfied some, as I've said, as well as satisfied others. Can you speak a little to how this has or has not worked for some of Lewis's readers, including some of his most devoted readers? Say N.T. Wright, has even named a book with allusion to mere Christianity, and yet he's dissatisfied with the trilemma. That doesn't mean he's dissatisfied with Lewis, but just this particular illustration.
Yes, I think Lewis is not deliberately or explicitly, certainly not explicitly, engaging with any previous person who has given utterance to this trilemma, insofar as he is echoing or engaging with anybody. The one that seems likeliest is G.K. Chesterton, because in the course of his remarks, Lewis says that either Jesus was who is and who he says he was, or he was a lunatic on a level with a man who says he's a poached egg, or he's the devil of hell, and you must make your choice. It's Lord, lunatic, or liar. But that reference to the poached egg is very revelatory, because that's not a common term. There are not many madmen who go around saying I'm a poached egg, but you will find a reference to a poached egg in G.K. Chesterton's book Orthodoxy, which we know Lewis to have read, and I think there Lewis is tipping his cap to G.K. Chesterton, whom he greatly admired, who he said was when Lewis was himself coming into the faith, he said that he thought G.K. Chesterton was the most sensible man alive, and he found the Everlasting Man to be hugely helpful in outlining a believable sketch of human history. So that, if he's engaging anyone, it's Chesterton, not anybody else. But I think, to your point, he really just sees the trilemma, as it's called, as a helpful line of logic. And yeah, I think if you pressed Lewis, he would say, well, it's a bit more complicated than I have made it out to be. But then, as he would quickly add, I was speaking to a very general audience, and I was on a Procrustean bed of 15 minutes. Each of these talks had to be no longer or shorter than 15 minutes. And there's only so much you can get into. You can't get into all the qualifications and the details and the possibilities about, fourth and fifth options, such as, well, maybe Jesus wasn't mad or evil. He was just honestly mistaken. Or maybe we can't trust the Bible records. Maybe there are scriptural and textual considerations to bring to bear on this question. And of course, Lewis would admit all that. But he's arguing for what he believes. He believes Christianity is true, and he believes that this trilemma, although not exhaustive, is certainly compelling, and will be good enough for the average man in the street. Lewis, although he was a highly intellectual man who could operate at stratospheric levels of nuance and precision, he never lost his connection with the man in the street. He, I think, retained a humility about his own learning and didn't expect everybody to rise to his level. Some of the time he would come down to their level, which after all he had not left behind, because, as he was keen on saying, the highest does not stand without the lowest. So, Lewis had only ascended to his own high eminence after going through those earlier stages of relatively elementary education, relatively rudimentary thinking. And he wasn't going to kick away the ladder by which he had ascended. So I think this relative simplicity of the trilemma speaks to Lewis's humility, and again to his own seriousness about driving towards a decision. He's not interested in just hot air and soft soap. He's wanting to force the issue to bring people to a point of decision. Choose this day whom you will serve. I mean, that is how he ends the second book. Let me just quote you, if I can find it. So the title of the second book, What Christians Believe, concludes with Lewis saying this: now, today, this moment is our chance to choose the right side. God is holding back to give us that chance. It will not last forever. We must take it or leave it. And similarly, in the fourth book, Beyond Personality, he closes with very urgent summons. Lose your life and you will save it. Submit to death, death of your ambitions and favorite wishes every day, and death of your whole body in the end. Submit with every fiber of your being and you will find eternal life. Keep back nothing. Nothing that you have not given away will be really yours. Nothing in you that has not died will ever be raised from the dead. Look for yourself and you will find in the long run only hatred, loneliness, despair, rage, ruin, and decay. But look for Christ and you will find him, and with him everything else thrown in. That's a fantastic peroration at the end of the book. But you can see from there, Lewis is not just conducting an academic seminar in which people throw out ideas and expatiate upon the latest theory. No, it's much more important than that. It's a life and death issue. And we need to come to a decision. And because it won't last, this opportunity to choose will not last forever.
Okay, I've got about, well, not quite 20 more questions. I've got many more questions I would love to ask, but I need to share the space with others. And so let's follow that and wrap up with my last question for you before Andre starts sending me some of the questions from people. And feel free to start direct messaging them to him if you haven't yet, folks, to the Adora Christi. And that is, I think this is an important one to hear from you on, because I know it's an area that's dear to you. I've met readers of Lewis in multiple countries who, whilst reverencing mere Christianity as a critical text of or for faith, and not only in their own personal journeys, but some using it as such as a teaching text, and yet they are uncomfortable with the genre of fantasy and may even take issue. I've known people who teach mere Christianity, but take issue with the Narnia books, let alone the Cosmic Trilogy, due to their fantastical nature. Is it the same C.S. Lewis who writes both of these things? How and why? Let's dive deeper into Lewis on reason and imagination and how that plays out in this text. The organ of meaning versus the organ of truth, or yeah, take us into that a little bit.
Well, it certainly is the same C.S. Lewis who writes both Mere Christianity and The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And this is one of the reasons why C.S. Lewis is such an interesting person to read and to study, because he can operate both in fiction and in non-fiction. And he can operate at a very high level of both, but also at a very general and universally accessible level of both. So he's not just both fiction and non-fiction, he's high and low in both columns at the same time. An amazing capacity for finding different registers and different frequencies on which to broadcast, as it were. One of the interesting things about Mere Christianity is the extent to which Lewis draws upon images, metaphors, analogies, similes. He's not writing in a dry and dusty fashion. He's not just drawing syllogisms. If A equals B and B equals C, therefore A equals C. It's nothing at all like that. That's far too prosaic for Lewis, who after all always wanted to be a poet, and his first 2 volumes that he published were books of poetry. Lewis never succeeded in getting much of a reputation as a poet, as a versifier, but he definitely had poetic gifts. He knew how language worked. He knew what words meant and how they connoted as well as denoted things. And he knew how to suggest as well as to state. So when I've been looking at Mere Christianity, I've been interested in the great variety of ways in which he talks about becoming a Christian, or coming to belief, or coming to faith in Christ, however you want to put it. Because he doesn't use a lot of technical theological language, nor even a lot of obviously biblical language. He draws upon much more everyday terminology and imagery, which he knows will resonate with any number of people, regardless of their level of education, regardless of their level of familiarity with the Bible. And because he's a great poet and he understands how symbols work, he's able to ring the changes on these different ways of putting it over and over and over again and still keep the thing fresh. So I came up with this list of ways in which he describes becoming a Christian. And let me just read you what I came up with. So becoming a Christian, according to just Mere Christianity, let alone his other works, is like joining a campaign of sabotage, like falling at someone's feet or putting yourself in someone's hands. It's like taking on board fuel or food. It's like laying down your rebel arms and surrendering, saying sorry, laying yourself open, turning full speed astern. It's like killing part of yourself. It's like learning to walk or to write. It's like buying God a present with his own money. It's like a drowning man clutching at a rescuer's hand, like a tin soldier or a statue becoming alive. It's like waking after a long sleep. It's like getting close to someone or becoming infected. It's like dressing up or pretending or playing. It's like emerging from the womb or hatching from an egg. It's like a compass needle swinging to north, or a cottage being made into a palace, or a field being ploughed and re-sown, or a horse turning into a Pegasus, or a greenhouse roof becoming bright in the sunlight. It's like coming round from anesthetic. It's like coming in out of the wind. It's like going home. All of those images are to be found in the pages of Mere Christianity. It's just a wealth of ways of talking about the thing itself, which is itself really inexpressible. Becoming a Christian, putting your faith in Christ, is not something that you can relate in words. It's extra literary. It's an action of the whole person, which can't be reduced to one verbal formulation. And this speaks to your question about his ability to write fantasy and fairy tale and imaginative literature. We call fantasy and fairy tale and fiction imaginative, but we should have noticed that Mere Christianity is itself already incredibly imaginative. There is no difference. The distinction is not between rational Mere Christianity and imaginative Narnia. Mere Christianity is itself rational and imaginative. And Narnia is both imaginative and rational. The question is not so much about reason or imagination, but whether you're going to look at something from the outside or along something from the inside. Because in fiction, you're placed into a stream of activity. You're alongside a set of characters who have their own adventures to undergo and their own conflicts to sort out. You're in the story. Whereas in Mere Christianity, you are listening to a presentation. You are, as it were, assessing Christianity from without and its plausibility and its credibility. Now, admittedly, Lewis, being such a poetically minded person, draws you into that contemplation, that assessment, that intellectual assessment. He draws you in with all those images I just listed. but still you're outside Christianity. In Narnia, as it were, you're inside a Christian world. You're having to interact within a story with a Christ character and with people who are in relationship with that Christ character. So you feel it from within. But both kinds of literature are equally rational and equally imaginative. It's just they go at it from different perspectives.
This ties in really well to one of the questions that is just simply, can you tell us a little bit of Lewis's shift from atheism to Christianity? And that, of course, ties in very well to what you've just been saying. So many of the people here will know that story, but many won't. So if you could just give a little glimpse into that, Michael, and then maybe tell people where they can read more about that, because there's been some wonderful things written.
Yeah, well, there's a lot that could be said about Lewis's own conversion, or as we should perhaps call it, reconversion. Because of course he had, after all, been raised as a Christian, he'd been baptized as a Christian, he'd been confirmed as a Christian in the Church of England. But then for about 2 decades, he turned away from the faith and was calling himself an atheist. And only in his early 30s did he come back, first of all, to a belief in God and then to a belief in the Christian God. And that story is really the subject of his autobiography, Surprised by Joy. So people should look to that if they want the details. Keeping it to a question of mere Christianity, I think the really crucial thing is just to say again how very converted a man C.S. Lewis himself was, because he had turned his back on his childhood faith, and indeed quite angrily and deliberately, resolutely, and come back to Christian faith painfully and slowly, and then very seriously, devoutly. He knew both sides of the equation. He knew what it was like to live in unbelief, and he knew what it was like to live in belief, and he knew what it was like to make the transition between the two. And that is one of the reasons why he's such a brilliant apologist and evangelist, in addition to all his communication skills that we've been talking about. Walter Hooper, who knew C.S. Lewis in the last year of his life, Walter Hooper said that C.S. Lewis was the most converted man he ever met. And
which he meant what?
Sorry?
By which he meant?
Well, by which he meant that Lewis was just thoroughly Christian. There was no part of Lewis's life which hadn't been touched by his faith. It spread into every department of life. And I think you can see the reality of Lewis's conversion in his own letters. If you look at Lewis's correspondence and the 3 years leading up to his Christian conversion and the 3 years following it, you can see that Lewis is becoming a different person. And the interesting thing is that he's not aware of it, because he's just writing these letters to various people. He's not reflecting upon himself as he writes, but the way that he writes changes. And you can see him becoming a more integrated person, a more humble and patient person. In other words, you can see the objective efficacy of Christian faith. It's making him a different man. It's making him a nicer man, to put it at the barest. Well, I shouldn't say that. That's a good point on which to revert back to Mere Christianity, because one of my favorite chapters of Mere Christianity is that chapter entitled "Nice People or New Men." Nice people or new men. Is Christianity about making people nice, or is it about making people new? And so I should really say that Lewis is becoming a new man, as well as a nicer man when he becomes a Christian. But the important thing is the newness, not the niceness. Because as he points out, I think very, very helpfully in that chapter, niceness, a personable character, a warm, friendly disposition, someone you can get on with, all those things are natural goods. They don't speak to whether a person believes in Christ or not. They will largely tell you whether the person has good digestion and was raised in a reasonably friendly environment. And he's saying nothing against those natural goods. They make people nice, But Christianity is not about making people nice. It's about making people new. The spiritual rebirth, the being born again, to quote Chuck Colson, to quote our Lord himself, of course, being born again from above, acquiring not just the biological life that we inherited from our parents, but acquiring what he calls Zoe life, spiritual life, from the Holy Spirit of God. And I've always found that chapter very, very helpful, because I myself have been blessed with a sound, comfortable, friendly home in which I was raised, and I've had a good education, and I've been blessed with good health, and all these things, I hope, make me a relatively sociable and personable member of society. But they don't make me a Christian. That has to come from a different source altogether. And so when you look at some poor person who's, you know, orphaned and abused and no education and no natural talents, no natural benefits, you know, from a purely natural and social point of view, they're not at all pleasant. But they may be devoutly Christian. They may have become reborn. They may have become new. It's just it's not beginning to show yet. It has to work its way through their system in order for you to tell that they are Christians. But in principle, they are, however horrible they may be to interact with. I think that's a really helpful distinction to disentangle questions of spirituality from questions of sociability.
One of my questions here is somebody says, one of the most famous quotations from Mere Christianity is, if we find ourselves with the desire that nothing in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that we were made for another world. Can you expound upon that or respond to it? Is that one of the points in which you agree with Lewis or push back?
Yes, I think I agree with him. Lewis is not there developing a conclusive argument that because we find this world unsatisfying, therefore there is another world. It's not that kind of syllogistic conclusion that he's driving at. It's more like, I think it's been called an abductive argument. From the fact that we find this world unsatisfying and desire permanence, we desire infinite goodness and truth and beauty. From that, a likely explanation from that is that we were made for another world. And that, you know, to quote St. Augustine, our hearts are restless because they haven't yet found their final resting place in God and in eternity. That's not an unreasonable inference to draw, but an inference is not the same as a conclusion. So I think that's an important distinction. Lewis is not setting this up as a watertight argument for Christianity. It's more like what John Henry Newman talks about as the illative sense, that there's in coming to faith, there's a convergence of probabilities. And one line of probability to consider is our own desire. Another line to consider would be, you know, the historical claims of the church. And a third would be textual evidence of the scriptures. And the fourth would be philosophical questions about the origin of ethics and conscience, as we've already discussed. So all these lines point, Lewis would argue, in a particular direction. And if you follow them thoroughly and wholeheartedly, they'll lead you eventually to that thing which is greater than and overarches them all, and which none of them, as it were, lead to securely in a necessary and inexorable step-by-step move. Because you can't, for all the value of apologetics, you can't argue people into Christian faith. At the end of the day, it has to be by the intervention of the Holy Spirit, and that you can only pray for and hope for. You can't, by definition, you can't hold God in the palm of your hand and force God onto people who don't want to receive. there has to be an openness, and that openness is a mysterious question. It has to do with providence and predestination even, but those are subjects that Lewis doesn't get into.
More to do with God than with us.
Yeah.
That kind of ties into this particular question. What would you say is one of the key challenges for Christians in communicating faith today that perhaps mere Christianity can speak to? What is one of the things that Lewis did really well, perhaps in that particular text, that we can learn from for Christians today? Or is indeed, as some people claim, the book merely dated? I think you've already kind of eloquently argued against that, but.
Well, I would agree that the book is dated in some respects. And I'm utterly convinced that if Lewis were still alive and writing today, he would put certain things in different ways. The remarkable thing is not that it's dated. Of course it's dated. A book from the 1940s is never going to be precisely how you would say something in 80 years later, or however long we are after it. The remarkable thing is how undated it is, and that it still has a remarkable freshness and purchase upon the modern mind, even though in one or two places you now think, that's looking a bit old-fashioned, so to speak. But those moments are relatively few and far between. The amazing thing is that the book holds up as well as it does. So I think, in answer to your question, one of the things that Lewis was doing in order to write a book which has lasted as long as it has, is that he has tried to avoid as much as possible fashionable controversies of his day and fashionable language of his day. And he's tried to reach for the perennial, the timeless, the central, rather than the peculiar or the eccentric or the hot button issues of his day. No. Let's just talk about why we think things are right and wrong. That's a very good starting point, and that never changes from one generation to the next. Whereas if he'd zoomed in straight on, I don't know. Well, you get the point. I don't need to thrash a dead horse here. Lewis was just interested in what he called the perennial philosophy, not just that which unites all Christians who are currently alive, but that which unites all Christians who have ever lived. That continuing central stream. Focus in on that, and then your book is unlikely to go out of relevance very quickly.
Okay, someone's tossed me another quotation here for you to unpack for us. And I'm afraid that is the sort of idea that the word morality raises in a good many people's minds. Something that interferes, something that stops you from having a good time. In reality, moral rules are directions for running the human machine. Every moral rule is there to prevent a breakdown or a strain or a friction in the running of that machine. Person follows this up with, could you develop on the notion of morality? Perhaps can you unpack any further what Lewis has to say there? And he unpacks it pretty well. But...
Yeah. To be honest, I can't very easily do that. The thing I will say though is that I'm interested there by Lewis's choice of language, the human machine, and I think that's again speaks to Lewis's skill as a communicator. Because I mean, for all that I was just saying, that he's not too bound to fashionable terminology and the hot button issues of his day. Nonetheless, he's not blind and deaf to what will gain him a hearing with people, and so he chooses his language carefully. So when he talks about the human machine, well, that's a carefully chosen metaphor, because he needn't have talked about machines, but he knows that in a mechanized and industrial society, the idea of putting the wrong sort of fuel in your car, or making some mistake in how you tool something up. That's quite a good metaphor. You know, we're no longer an agrarian society in this country, so he's less apt to draw from farming and agricultural imagery. Likewise, elsewhere in Mere Christianity, he talks about evolution. And he talks, we've already mentioned the new man, and Lewis will sometimes draw upon the concept of evolution in order to explain the means by which Christ's life is communicated to us. Again, because he thinks that especially skeptics who might buy into, you know, a very materialistic Darwinian understanding of evolution will think, oh, well, that's our term, that's our language. But no, he quite cleverly goes and steals their clothes, as it were. So, well, evolution just means, you know, development. So we needn't be afraid of that word. That's just clever stylistic, a clever stylistic move. Again, helps things keep fresh and vital and urgent. Now, Kirstin, we're drawing to the end of my time. I'm afraid I have to go in 3 minutes. So can I just conclude by quoting you two passages from C.S. Lewis? We're talking about Mere Christianity on its 70th anniversary. And of course, here in England, this year, we have celebrated the Platinum Jubilee of Her late Majesty the Queen Elizabeth, who alas died in September. But in February this year, she marked 70 years on the throne. And Mere Christianity is also 70 years old this year. So I thought I'd just end now by quoting two passages from Lewis, one about the Queen's coronation, which he saw on television, or that he heard about from people who had seen it on television, and then a passage from Mere Christianity, which I think is relevant in the same vein. So in 1952, rather 1953, the year of the Queen's coronation, an American correspondent wrote to Lewis and said, "Oh, wasn't the coronation of the Queen marvelous? It was such a fairy tale." And Lewis wrote back and said, "You know, over here, people did not get that fairy tale feeling about the coronation. What impressed most who saw it was the fact that the Queen herself appeared to be quite overwhelmed by the sacramental side of the ceremony. Hence, in the spectators, a feeling of, one hardly knows how to describe it, awe, pity, pathos, mystery. The pressing of that huge, heavy crown on that small, young head becomes a sort of symbol of the situation of humanity itself. Humanity called by God to be his vice-regent and high priest on earth, yet feeling so inadequate, as if God said, 'In my inexorable love, I shall lay upon the dust that you are glories and dangers and responsibilities beyond your understanding.' Do you see what I mean?" Lewis says to the correspondent. "One has missed the whole point unless one feels that we have all been crowned, and that coronation is somehow, if splendid, a tragic splendor." So that's Lewis on the Queen. And now, just to finish with a passage from Mere Christianity, which touches on this question of splendor, but tragic splendor. Lewis says this: "Imagine yourself as a living house. God comes in to rebuild that house. At first, perhaps, you can understand what he's doing. He's getting the drains right and stopping the leaks in the roof and so on. You knew that those jobs needed doing, and so you are not surprised. But presently, he starts knocking the house about in a way that hurts abominably and doesn't seem to make sense. What on earth is he up to? The explanation is that he's building quite a different house from the one you thought of, throwing out a new wing here, putting on an extra floor there, running up towers, making courtyards. You thought you were going to be made into a decent little cottage, but he is building a palace. He intends to come and live in it himself." fantastic image of God the King, Christ the King. Of course, we're approaching the end of the church year and the celebration of Christ the King. Christ the King is coming to live in this house, and he needs a palace. And being transformed from a little cottage into a palatial residence is, to say the least, unexpected and awkward at times, but hopefully glorious in the end.
Amen.
I must go. Goodbye. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ward.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Michael. Bye, Dr. Ward. We won't be able to give a prolonged thank you to Michael because he is off at 1:31 precisely. Irrevocably. There, I did it, guys. He is irrevocably gone. Well, for this particular Zoom. But please feel free actually to, if you're Facebook connected to Dr. Ward or Instagram connected to him in some other way, feel free to send him off a thank you for this time that he spent with us. And thank you for being part of this time. I'm going to hand us back to Denise to wind up, but also a reminder for those of you who can stick around as Dr. Dickinson pulls us into a time of casual conversation. There are a slew of wonderful McDonald's scholars who are here today, some of whom might be able to join us for the conversation, and students, scholars, non-officially academic, but in their heart academic, people who thought long and hard about this book in different ways, used it in different ways. So please do come and join us for further conversation, which I know will continue to be rich, even though we've lost Dr. Ward for the moment. So thank you all, and Denise, over to you.